Congratulations to you on your appointment to serve on one of the governing boards of the public colleges and universities in the state of Texas. In joining this board, you will be part of the group of 50,000 men and women in the United States who help oversee higher education in our nation. It's an important job and one that I think that you'll enjoy, but find challenging as you go. I'm Susan Johnston. I'm Executive Vice President of AGB, and like you, I also serve as a board member. I serve on the board of Radford University, a public university in my home state of Virginia. I'm also a member of the board of Rollins College, my alma mater in Winter Park, Florida. From experience, I know the kinds of work that you are going to be engaged in very soon, and I congratulate you again on your appointment. AGB is a premier national organization focused on improving and strengthening the governance of colleges and universities, public and private, throughout the United States. In over 90 years, we have published books, magazines, and other articles and white papers. We do consulting, we have programming, we have a variety of resources on our website. All of these can be available to you to provide support to you as you grow into your service as board members, and we hope that you will take advantage of those opportunities and resources. AGB is very pleased to work with the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board to develop this material for you. We hope that you'll find it helpful.
The question of what advice I'd give to a board member when he or she is joining a board of an institution or a system board in the public side of higher education is severalfold. One, get a clear sense coming in as to what the specific responsibilities of an individual board member are, but also get a clear awareness of the legal principles associated with being a part of a fiduciary body that while it carries the ultimate authority of making decisions about an institution, also recognizes that making decisions or decision making in higher education is complex, and to realize that this isn't like being on a corporate board. There are many voices, and so a new board member has a steep learning curve, and to take the time before they get to their first meeting, becoming fully aware of what those responsibilities are and their role in them.
Being a fiduciary means that you have a very special relationship. That means that you have a relationship that others don't have with regard to the institution. Ultimately, it simply means that you have a special responsibility for the administration, for the monitoring, for the investment, for the distribution of assets that are entrusted to your care. In this case, it might be the physical assets, the bricks and mortar, if you will, of the institution. It might be the endowment, the cash, capital support of the organization, but it also means the faculty, the students, the reputation, all of the things that are truly assets of a college or a university. Financial responsibility is something that everyone connected with a college or university has in one fashion or another. Students have a financial responsibility to pay their tuition, to pay for room and board, to find a way to either do that themselves or to work with the financial aid department of the school and make sure that that happens. Officers, the chief financial officer, treasurer of an organization, for example, has financial responsibility to make sure that the budget is balanced, or if it's a deficit budget, figuring out where those funds are going to come from. That's a responsibility that is a part of what everyone brings to a college or university. A fiduciary responsibility is different. A fiduciary responsibility is unique to directors and officers of an organization, for a college or university to its trustees or officers. Here's an example I think that's useful as a way to think of what a fiduciary is. Imagine that you're a lifeguard. You're a very well-trained lifeguard. You're at the pool, but it's your day off. You're on the chaise lounge, you're reading the newspaper, you're just relaxing, taking it easy, but you notice out of the corner of your eye that there's a guy going down in the deep end, down for the count in the pool. Do you have a fiduciary responsibility, a legal responsibility to dive in and help that fellow? The answer is no, you don't. You have a moral duty? You bet. But do you have a legal responsibility to go in and dive in and save that person? The answer is no. Now imagine the same set of facts, only this time you're up in the chair. This time you're the paid lifeguard for that pool. You have the whistle around your neck, you're up in the chair, you're looking, and you see this poor fellow going down for the count. Now do you have a responsibility to dive in and save that fellow? You bet. Now you have a special responsibility that others around the pool, even those that may be trained lifeguards, don't have. You have a special responsibility to go in and protect that individual. That's the essence of a fiduciary responsibility. Others may have that training, but only trustees have that responsibility for a college or a university. The biggest stumbles that I've seen, the stumbles that tend to end up on the front page of newspapers, are where a board is not fully engaged, where decisions are being made by a very autocratic board chair or by a small group of trustees that might not even be the executive committee, or it could be the executive committee, but you're not getting really full board involvement, full board engagement. Oftentimes this is an issue around the compensation of the president, and again, that decision being made in a very small group. Everyone that's around the trustees table is there for a reason. Everyone that's around the trustees table has a fiduciary responsibility. So if you don't have that information in front of you, let's talk about compensation. If you've got a process where the rest of the trustees have no opportunity to ask questions about why compensation was set at the level it was, or what the goals and objectives are for the president going forward, what an incentive bonus might look like, and what are the things we're incentivizing. If you don't have the full board involved in that process, it's a recipe for front page news. Poorer decisions are inevitably going to be made. And when you've seen these kinds of stories, that's usually what's happened. Single board chair or a very small group are making those decisions. So full board engagement, you can have the heavy lifting being done by a comp committee, an executive committee, or a specific committee for the issue that's before the board. But ultimately, they're committees. Bring it back to the full board, get full board engagement. That's really the best way to go. Another mistake that boards make sometimes, however well-intentioned, is to expose themselves to personal liability. Now, you may serve as a trustee on a board and think, well, I'm acting in furtherance of the college or the university. They'll get sued. I won't get sued. I have no personal liability here. And that's not exactly true. You do have personal liability if you don't act in good faith, if you don't exercise that fiduciary duty of care, if you don't exercise that fiduciary duty of loyalty. So, for example, if I act on some business opportunity that I only knew about because I was a trustee of that university and use my inside information to exercise and make that business opportunity come through, I've just breached my fiduciary duty of loyalty, and I've exposed myself to personal liability for usurping that business opportunity. There are all kinds of ways in which you can do that. Another way of exposing yourself to personal liability goes back to the duty of care is not coming to the meetings, not reading the materials, voting when you don't have any clue what you're voting about, or not showing up and voting at all. You can have personal liability, you can have responsibility in that regard. Let's imagine a setting where you're paying your private independent institution, you're paying your president, and you've got all the data in front of you, and it says really the best number or best range that you could provide to that president is $400,000 to $450,000. And then you sit around the board and you say, well, we're going to pay this president $800,000 because by God, she's worth it. She works her fingers to the bone. She's given everything to this university. We just think she's one in a million, and we're going to give her $800,000. Well, that may be very well intended, and every word of that may be true. But as a matter of law, you've just ignored the hard objective evidence of what that position is worth, and you've said, the heck with that, we're going to make our own decision. Now you've acted in a way that exposes yourself to personal liability under what are called the intermediate sanctions law. In the worst case, you could be paying $20,000 out of your own pocket because of that well-intended but clearly erroneous decision that you made. So personal liability is another area where boards make mistakes. If you honor your fiduciary duty, if you do those things we've talked about, your risk of personal liability is quite small.
The question that's often asked is to whom and for what are boards accountable? I think in 2007, 2008, AGB issued a statement on board accountability, which I think carries as much weight and is as maybe more important today than it was when it was first approved by AGB's board of directors. There are certain inherent values that boards need to recognize, they have to champion, they have to support. Among those is the defense of academic freedom and institutional as well as board independence, institutional self-regulation as defined by accreditation, and also a recognition that whether they are a board of a public or a private institution, they are responsible for serving the public trust. I'm often asked how to define public trust when it comes to governing boards' responsibilities. Too many times, boards of independent or private colleges and universities show a little bit of curiosity when we say they have as much responsibility for serving the public, meeting the public trust, as do their counterpart boards in serving public higher education. All of our institutions have a public role, and it is incumbent on the boards of trustees of each of these institutions to be a primary voice and buffer, if you will, between the institution and the greater public good. It is clearly a part of the fiduciary principles that they sign on to serving when they agree to serve at the request of being part of a political process that gets them on a board, or through a self-perpetuating selection process that private institutions serve.
Let's look directly at some of these responsibilities now. And what follows here really is kind of the accumulated wisdom of AGB on essential responsibilities of boards. It's kind of a compendium of best practices, if you will, for boards as articulated by AGB and is filtered a bit through my own experience. Each institution is different. Each board is different. Boards have ultimate fiduciary responsibility to their institutions. And kind of obvious to say, I think there are two core pieces to that fiduciary responsibility. The board is there to ensure that the institution's meeting its mission. Do you know the mission of the board? Do you have an elevator speech? If somebody said, what's the mission of University X where you're a trustee? Probably a good thing to have that in mind as a little elevator speech. Sometimes the board needs to change the mission, if that needs to change in the board's wisdom. But you should have a deep understanding and feel for what the mission is, and your decisions should be placed in the framework of that mission always. Second big fiduciary responsibility, I think, is to ensure the longer-term longevity of the institution, its longer-term viability. Are you helping the leadership of the institution and stakeholders to look forward in an adequate way so that it's ready to meet the challenges that are coming down the pipeline, challenges in fulfilling its mission on out through the future. Boards are responsible for the recruitment, compensation, performance review of the president of the institution. Most trustees I've worked with will say that's our most important job, is getting the right CEO, overseeing the work of the CEO, evaluating it, helping him or her to improve, that's the most important thing we do. And I think that is true. I'd agree with that. The board broadly defines the educational mission of the institution, determines generally the academic programs of the institution, and is ultimately accountable for the quality of the learning experience. So mission, programs, quality. Mission, programs, quality. I think those three words should be at the core of your consciousness as a trustee. Your boards are overseers of the public trust they hold and need to be accountable for meeting the public trust in ways that are appropriate to the mission of the institution. These are public positions, and your board will be involved, if it hasn't already, with you on it, in making some hard decisions that people will disagree with. And you will take some shots as a result of your willingness to be a trustee at a public college or university. And that's part of this accountability. You're in the middle of what can sometimes be an intense public dialogue, right? And some of you who've been around for a while, I know, have felt the heat on some occasions around those kinds of controversies that your institution may have gotten involved in. I think if you are accountable and are transparent, though, and can explain the decisions, people, even if they strongly disagree, will respect the decisions over time. Sometimes it doesn't feel like they're being very respectful right at the moment. But these are people sometimes inside the institution as well as external stakeholders. But transparency and accountability, really important part of fulfilling that very public trust that you hold. Boards are responsible for ensuring the independence of the institution and for safeguarding academic freedom. Independence and academic freedom. The analogy I like to use on this is to say boards, I think, need to be both buffers and conduits. So sometimes it will be your role to buffer for the people inside the institution who need to get on doing their important work, teaching, research, outreach, buffer them from outside influence, interference. At other times, I think a board needs to be a bit of a conduit, needs to let some of the heat in to move the institution. And doing that in a way that's strategic with your president or chancellor can be an important role. You know, part of the reason you are where you are is to bring an outside perspective to the institution where you serve as a trustee. And sometimes you're going to need to press that. Sometimes you're going to say, wait a minute, these folks on the inside need to go on and get on with their work. I'll take the heat on this one and let them do that. Without academic freedom, there is no university. Might as well shut the doors and go home. And it's really important that trustees understand that and know how to defend it appropriately. It's equally important, I might say, that people inside the institution, faculty most notably, understand something about that and exercise that academic freedom appropriately and judiciously. I'll give you a negative example. In the last couple months, one of my faculty colleagues at the University of Wisconsin-Madison made an analogy between the governor and Adolf Hitler. This caused all sorts of a stir, as you can imagine, and in her point of view, well, this was just part of my academic freedom. It means I can say what I think. Well, yeah, it means you should be able to propound your discipline and what it has to say to the world in ways that you understand it. It doesn't mean you can and should say anything that you damn well please. So I was pleased to see how we handle that. The main part of it being the executive committee of the faculty senate at the Madison campus issued a statement saying they didn't think this was the appropriate exercise of academic freedom. And I thought that was exactly the right way to handle that. So that's an area that, you know, can get very touchy, and boards need to understand their role in that regard. Boards define the terms of shared governance within their institutions through respect for traditions of shared governance, including delegation of recommendations for academic policy to faculty. So this shared governance thing is unlike anything that goes on in any other kind of organization, really, that I think most of us are familiar with. And it's a constant back and forth between yourselves as trustees, yourselves as presidents, CEOs, and the people inside the academy, fully inside the faculty and staff, and the students very often getting involved with this. A point I'll make is that boards and the CEO have the final fourth in the back and forth. That is, shared governance does not mean shared decision-making on every item. Why not? Well, for one reason, there'll be items where people will disagree, and you can't come to a shared decision, and somebody has to make one. And that will be the chancellor or the president with your support, hopefully. But, you know, I'd urge you to exercise that final say when it comes to shared governance in the spirit of what Justice Felix Frankfurter called the 4 freedoms of the university. He said that these are the 4 freedoms that universities have in this country. To determine for itself on academic grounds, 1, who may teach, 2, what may be taught, 3, how it should be taught, and 4, who may be admitted to study. Who may teach, what may be taught, how it should be taught, and who may be admitted to study. Now, boards typically delegate those decisions to faculty and administration, at the same time retaining oversight of them and the right to intervene if the institution is going off the rails because poor decisions are being made. But that is a delicate back and forth dance. The ultimate authority on all four of those freedoms rests with the Board of Trustees to protect and defend, but the Board of Trustees, again, because these are academic matters, typically delegates them for their operations to faculty, staff, administration at the institution, retaining the final right to intervene as necessary. Boards make decisions about finance, including the approval of the budget, establishment of guidelines for the allocation of resources, and strategic financial planning as an element of their role in strategic planning. So this is about following the money, as we like to say, and determining if you're comfortable about where the money is going. That's part of your role as a trustee, and following the money in these institutions. Really hard, right? I mean, it's not neat. The revenue streams, the cost centers are complex, and it's not a clear pathway to follow, but you need to get skilled in doing that. Number 8, boards are responsible for reaching out to multiple constituencies, internal and external, to maintain a respectful and open flow of communication between relevant stakeholder groups. Now, who are those stakeholder groups, right? You got students, you got faculty, you got staff, you got alumni, you got donors, you have prospective donors, you have athletics boosters, you have governors, you have legislators, you have mayors, you have business leaders, you have nonprofit leaders, you have community leaders, you have the media, you have perhaps more than ever the federal government in play here, and on and on and on. So the point here, I think, is that the university is not a business with a defined customer base. It's more like a cult with a far-flung, eclectic group of believers who all believe something different about what the university ought to be doing. And you as trustees, you as the president or chancellor, are in the middle of all of that, of all of those stakeholders. And I think you're kind of the key set of what I'll call interlocutors that needs to be talking to all of those different stakeholders about what the university is doing, what the college is doing, what it needs to be doing, what it should be doing. You're kind of, I like to describe trustees as the innie-outie group. You know, some people have innie belly buttons, some people have outie belly buttons. Well, you need to have both, because people outside will see you as captured by the inside. People on the inside will see you as representative of all those pressure groups from outside that they wish would go away. That's kind of the role, and it's a tricky one. Number 9. Boards need to understand the legal and regulatory environment within which their institution operates and ensure compliance with fiscal, academic, licensing, and other standards. This is not the glamorous part of it, but it's basic, and it's so important. You know, we live in an age of transparency. We live in an era of distrust by the public of all institutions, not just universities. It's the government, it's business, it's the church, it's the university. And I think that's partly because we are so transparent. People can see all the warts now in a way they weren't able to not that long ago. And sometimes they get fixated on the warts, not the rest of the body. And we need to help them focus sometimes on the rest of the body. You need to help the president do that, but you need to do it by being transparent, admitting when there are mistakes, and making sure you go back to towing the line on those legal regulatory requirements. And if you don't, the brand of your institution will be mightily damaged at some point. And that goes back to that initial fiduciary responsibility about ensuring the long-term viability of your institution. Part of that is keeping the recognition and the good feeling about the brand of your institution high, and you've got to pay attention to that stuff to do that. Number 10, conduct the board's business in an exemplary fashion and with appropriate transparency, there it is again, adhering to the highest ethical standards and complying with applicable open meeting and public records laws, ensure the currency of board governance policies and practices, and periodically assess the performance of the board, its committees, and its members. There's a whole lot of stuff in there, and we don't have time to talk about all of it. Just on the last one, this idea of having periodically a board self-assessment or assessment, I mean, that's a good practice in my experience, more honored in the breach than in the keeping. And why is that? Well, I think it's kind of hard for boards to do this. I mean, who assesses them? Well, they have to assess themselves at some level. And this is, I recognize most of us who work with you do, who are administrators in your institutions, this is an unpaid job that you have. And you give huge numbers of hours and time and energy to do this. And we thank you for that. So, but how do you do an assessment to make sure you're on the right track as a board, as an individual trustees? I'll just put in a pitch again to say AGB does do that. They have experienced people who have worked with boards to do self-assessments and do them in a public environment, right? I mean, one of the tricks here is not to do a self-assessment and you're a public university. And again, every wart is shoved under the nose of the media in the state for them to write about for the next 3 months. These need to be done very carefully, but if you can do them, they can be very important and formative and useful for you as individuals and for your institution. The board and president partnership, and again, goes back to the notion that hiring and cultivating the leadership career of your CEO is probably the most important thing you do as a board member. I think some of the elements of this is having clear expectations, the board of the president and the president of the board. It is a mutual, or should be a mutual set of expectations, and they should be clear. I think they should be laid out clearly what those expectations are year by year at the beginning of the year of the performance cycle in a document that you agree on. And then there should be some assessment of the performance after that year goes by based on your assessment of how that president is doing. Now, again, in a public environment, you've got to be really careful about what is available to the press to write about or not. And different states have different laws about what you can do in executive session or not, and do any assessment like this very, very carefully. And it's got to be mutual in the sense that the president needs to be able to say to the board, all right, I hear what you're saying about my performance. I want to talk a little bit about how helpful you've been, and in other areas where I think you could be more helpful in the future, to put it politely. So that assessment, if it's done right on the clear expectations, will be to some extent an assessment of the board as well an assessment of the president, if it's done right. I think the next three pieces here are of a piece: a common sense of purpose, a shared vision, and a mutually agreed upon plan. Number 4 needs to be what you use to implement number 3 and number 2. And number 4, that plan, strategic plan, as you might call it, needs to have some strategies and some tactics about how to get to that purpose, how to actually make that vision come real. It's got to have some metrics, got to have some numbers that you can track with your president about how the institution under her or his leadership is doing in that regard. And then the last thing, a commitment to inclusion by all stakeholders. These partners, the president and the board, both as a group, the board, and as individuals, will be judged by all the stakeholders, in no small part by the nature of this relationship. And when that relationship goes south, especially in a public institution, you've got a problem, and it's a problem the media loves to focus on, and you've had some examples of that in this state recently, and it's not good for the institution when that happens. Some broad conversations on the part of trustees with stakeholders are fine, Others are not so good. Let me give you an example by what I mean around this issue of stakeholders and communication. It is all about communication in this partnership between the board and the president with those stakeholders surrounding you all, watching what you're doing. So if you as a trustee go to the vice president for finance, right, and say, well, how do you think President Riley's really doing? How do you think he's doing? That okay? So when you do that as a trustee, you put the vice president for finance in a very difficult, awkward position because she wants to be loyal to you as a trustee of her institution. And if it's working right, she wants to be loyal to the president. Now, if you're kind of implying maybe you think things aren't going so well with President Riley, I think the way to handle that is to go to the board chair, have a conversation with him or her, and decide what kind of conversation you and the board chair together or the board chair might have with President Riley about your concern. So there are some sensitive do's and don'ts around this partnership to make it work well, and that's just one example.
Welcome to this discussion of board culture and citizen trusteeship. I'm Meryl Schwartz, Vice President for AGB Consulting. I'm delighted to talk with you about one of the keys to successful work for board members and boards, a healthy board culture. When you join a board, you should have a formal orientation to your responsibilities as a trustee. Often, orientations focus as much on the responsibilities of administrators and how they do their work as on the work of the board. Typically, even less is said about the unwritten rules of how the board does its work and the expectations board members have for one another. The culture of a board is the sum of those traditions, customs, values, and expectations, and determines to a great extent how the board works and what it spends its time on. As a new board member, you can observe some of this on your own, but should ask questions or seek out an experienced board member to learn about your board's culture. The formal rules for board work are the laws and bylaws that define the board's authority and structure its organization and activities. Most of the rest is culture. Assumptions and expectations are an expression of culture, as are value judgments about what's right and wrong. It includes simple things you want to get right, like, don't sit there, that's where John always sits, and things that have deeper implications for whether the board has substantive conversations and invites questions and opposing views. Cultures are well established, but also change and evolve. New members with different expectations, a change in board or institutional leadership, a crisis, or event of good fortune could change the board's culture. A new board member may influence or change the norms of behavior for the board. Many new board members expect to spend much of their first year listening and learning. The culture of the academy, as well as the culture of the board, is new for most members. Like an iceberg, much of the board's culture is below the waterline, out of view. Although it isn't visible, it influences direction and may be stronger than the formal visible rules. In comparing the social aspects of a group or its culture with the organization of an institution or its structure, I think culture has a much stronger influence. As Dick Chait, board authority and author, once said, "Culture eats structure for lunch." When a board lets conflicts of interest slide rather than addressing them and recusing or removing board members, when decisions that should be made by the full board are routinely made by a subgroup of the board, when board members use back channel routes to communicate with campus leaders rather than working through the board chair and president, this undermines the board's effectiveness and reflects poorly on the norms and expectations of the board. Often this contributes to poor decisions and bad press for boards. No lone rangers.
This is one of my favorite images for conveying the idea that only boards, not individuals, have authority to act on behalf of the board and institution. Individuals don't have the power of the board unless specifically delegated by the board for a specific purpose, such as the chair speaking for the board or signing documents. Even the board chair has limited powers in that role and otherwise has no more power than any other board member. Board members have responsibilities as individuals to act as fiduciaries, to come to meetings prepared, to act reasonably, and so on, but only the board can act for the board. So, no lone rangers. Some of the hallmarks of good, productive board culture were captured by Jeffrey Sonnenfeld in a Harvard Business Review article about what makes great boards great. These characteristics include the kinds of things that make for good relationships: trust, candor, willingness and ability to fill in and do what needs to be done, being accountable for your own actions, and taking time out from regular work to look at the group as a whole, reflecting on areas of strength and weakness, and making changes to improve performance. We've said that culture is like an iceberg. It's hard to see and most lies beneath the surface. Thinking about failures of culture might help point out the essential elements for success. Boards are dysfunctional when, one, decisions are made by a few members and the rest aren't kept informed or included. 2, individual board members don't do much of anything or act on their own, either unengaged or overly engaged in the wrong ways. 3, individuals fail to act as fiduciaries, fail to act in the best interests of the institution as a whole, and instead are one-issue members or representatives of one group, program, or campus. 4, the board's agenda isn't well planned to allow the board to act when it should, and the executive committee is regularly relied on to act for the board. 5, people don't listen to one another, don't respect one another, and can't work together. 6, the board doesn't focus on the work that matters most, or is unable to do its work effectively. 7, the board delves into management level work and decisions, often at the expense of work on substantive strategic issues. 8, there's poor communication and a lack of transparency. 9, members ignore the rules that should guide and govern the work of the board. Here are some tools that can help build a better board. Having clear statements of expectation that spell out the norms for board member behavior. These can be provided to board members even before they join the board. Clear protocols for communication that ensure transparency and keep people informed. Agendas that focus on the things that matter most. Having a shared sense of purpose and social solidarity. Educating new board members through an effective orientation and making continuing board education part of every board meeting or regular board meetings and retreats. Having ways to discipline board members, and that means not expecting the president to step in and discipline the board. That would never be appropriate. Maybe making sure the general counsel is part of meetings to let the board know when it's wandering in the wrong direction, but making sure that you have ways to keep the board's work on track. Making time for difficult conversations and knowing how to conduct them in a respectful, inclusive way. Taking time to systematically affect the board's performance and doing it periodically, and then regularly reviewing the board for healthy board interaction, maybe even at the end of every board meeting. I hope these ideas help you understand your board better and how you can contribute to making it an effective and enjoyable team. Thank you.
Right now, in the time we live in, there's enormous scrutiny going on of higher education and the boards that govern the colleges and universities. And one of the ones that probably concerns me the most is the issue of boards speaking with one voice. Trustees don't always realize the damage it can do for there to be a public perception that the board is divisive, the board's in disarray, they're not agreeing, and it's contentious. And the reason is this, and this is a very simple but important point to make, and that is that the reputation of a college or university is absolutely vital to that institution. And boards, in the way they occur in the public perception of boards as leadership in universities and colleges, really are the face of the institution, along with the president. But if that face of the institution seems to be contentious, in disarray, divisive, it really gives a very bad public perception. And again, reputation is so critical to these institutions at a time where the public spotlight is very much on them, and at a time where there's competition for students. They want to always occur as in their best possible light. One of the things about trusteeship is that trustees are really guardians of the reputation of the university. They're guardians. Really, they hold the keys to the future. That's what fiduciary responsibility is all about. And if they occur in a negative way, it can hurt the reputation of the university. So what I want to say is reputation matters, and for boards to air their dissension outside of the university is not constructive. There have been recently a lot of high-profile governance failures where we saw that. But I could look back to one that I encountered and know of personally, and that is the case of a presidential search happening for a university. At the end of the search process, the search committee recommended a particular candidate that had the full support of the university communities, and that the board then had a divided vote to approve. And the majority approved the recommendation of the search committee, and that president was appointed. But those trustees that were on the board that hadn't supported that president, who'd supported another candidate who they'd gotten to know in the search process, then proceeded to make their dissent public. And it really hurt that president's new tenure coming on board. You know, that's an important time when a new president comes on board with the university, that all go well and smoothly. It's an important transition. And the fact that dissenting members spoke publicly about their dissent was just not constructive. Now, the good news is that president went on to serve with great distinction for more than 11 years at that university, and it was one of the most successful presidencies that university has known. That president raised more money than had ever been raised before, and made an enormous difference at the university. But it was troubling that whole first year that there was this sort of shadow over trustees that were dissenting. And one of the hard things for, let me add this, one of the hard things for trustees can be to feel passionately about a particular issue and to lose the vote on the board in support of it. It's always tough, you know, that's human for us to feel strongly as trustees or as regents about a particular policy issue and then to lose a vote. But it's so important for trustees to all rally behind and support the vote and the position that the board has taken as a whole. It just serves no good purpose for dissenting trustees to make their dissent known. Now, that's not to say that spirited discussion and vetting policy issues isn't critical, because it is, but it really needs to happen in the boardroom, and more specifically, it really should happen in the committees. That's what board committees are there for. You know, in the world of public colleges and universities, the open meeting laws, the sunshine laws, can be very constraining in terms of what's allowed to be in a private executive session. but certain kind of topics particularly need to be in an executive session, whether that's about personnel or maybe legal issues or real estate or whatever, can be very sensitive. And if those issues, if trustees essentially violate the confidentiality of those sessions, that can have serious legal ramifications on the university. This is really why board education is so critical. Trustees, one of the things that is unique, as we all know, about the American system of governance in higher education is we're not higher education professional experts. We're lay members of citizen boards and don't necessarily know what is appropriate for trustees. So often, some of the worst things happen where it's just unknowingly trustees don't realize that they've violated some of the principles of good governance. For one thing, I would make sure that they understand that an individual trustee has no real authority, that it is the board as a whole that has that authority. And then I would really remind them that the reason that they've accepted this appointment is to advance the cause of that institution. You know, many are often alums, but they have some stake in wanting to do a good job, wanting to advance that institution and help them in every way. That I can remember an instance as a member of a governing board of being on a search committee, and when the final vote came for whether to recommend one of two finalist candidates, I was in the minority. It was a 3-2 vote from the search committee. I felt it was a mistake, the hire that was made, and down the line, it didn't turn out well. But right after that vote, where I was one of two dissenting votes on a committee of 5, I moved to make it unanimous from the search committee because I realized I'd lost and that now it would be much more positive for a unanimous recommendation to go forward from the search committee to the full board and to hire that president because I was in the minority on that particular vote. So I think that's the way it's supposed to go, and because I've had some training in governance, I knew that. But it was a little bit hard for me. I thought, I'd heard from the faculty, they didn't want this candidate. I thought, I don't think this is a good idea, but it will serve no good purpose for me to make my position known outside the boardroom.
Well, I think at the time you're doing a plan, and until one has made a decision, I'm fine for dissenting voices because I think it's only through some dissidence that you're going to get real discussion. So I actually encourage that kind of sort of conversation because that's the way we start to bring out who's believing what, who thinks what, and adding expertise and data to the process. So I'm all for it, but I think once we make a decision as a board, then we should all go forward in tandem, and that decision has been taken, and we should go forward. We've not had a problem with that, actually. I've not seen any rollback decision-making, as I would call it. So we haven't really had that problem to my knowledge. But I don't necessarily clamp down on dissenting, discussion on a particular topic if I think there is a good reason for that discussion to continue. I mean, the chair can always exercise the gavel if they so choose to do. I do that very rarely, but I happen to have on the board a couple of really good consensus makers who can do the sort of the wrap up on discussions when they can see that it's probably time to wrap the discussion up. So I'm blessed by having a couple of board members who actually do that and may, if it's appropriate, call for a vote or put a motion on the table. So I think that's a handy thing, and actually cultivating that as a chair, if you've got that competency somewhere on your board, is very handy because sometimes you cannot do it from the chair.
The stakeholders that boards need to be responsive of and respectful with are both internal stakeholders and increasingly external stakeholders. So internally, governing boards have to recognize the important partnership that they have with institutional leadership, the president and his or her team, or the chancellor and his or her team. Certainly the faculty is a big part of this. It is very difficult to run these institutions, colleges and universities, without a faculty that feels engaged and gets a sense from the top that they are respected and that their views are both solicited and appreciated. Students are certainly critical, increasingly so, just by virtue of the options that students have, both to either attend our institution or attend other institutions and other optional forms of a higher education. Students are an important part of the makeup of the stakeholders group. Staff as well can't be ignored when it comes to internal stakeholders. But what I think we're also seeing today in terms of stakeholders is the very real and increased pressure coming from outside our institutions. Certainly public policy makers, as it relates to a public institution or even an independent or private college or university, are demonstrating their concerns, their interests about the efficiency and the success of our colleges and universities to meet their mission, to control costs, to educate students successfully, to ensure that the students that are graduating or leaving the institution with a degree or a certificate are prepared to enter the workforce of the 21st century. There may be other points of view, but policymakers for sure are assessing institutions at that level. Additionally, the media has an ongoing and increased sense of interest in the success of our colleges and universities. Corporate leaders, for sure, are concerned about the quality of the product that our institutions are turning out and making available to the corporations. Parents and donors and the corporate and foundation sector, in terms of the corporate and philanthropic sector, are all very willing to weigh in to try to impact and to add their specific thoughts. And boards really do have a responsibility in carrying out their role to serve the public interest and serve the public trust, to be willing to listen. Doesn't mean they need to adhere to any or all of the specific urgings coming from certainly external stakeholders, but they need to demonstrate a willingness to listen. If you put all of these stakeholders together, it both adds to the challenges associated with shared governance in any institution, and it adds to the pressures of governing boards and governing board members to know how to balance their fiduciary responsibilities with being good listeners, able to demonstrate an inclusionary kind of process.
Boards and presidents have to work in partnership, and especially when we're discussing some of these very big environmental and contextual issues that relate to a number of strategic opportunities or strategic challenges going forward. Boards and presidents have to increase that sense of partnership. Presidents have a responsibility to help boards understand the issues. Boards have a responsibility to understand their role and not cross over into micromanagement. That said, there's just tremendous intellectual capacity on boards that presidents ought to be welcoming as ways to think through some of these major strategic issues. When I work with boards and presidents, I like to help them see the partnership
as a kind of iterative process. Boards really do have an important responsibility to set expectations and hold people accountable. They have a kind of framing role. Here are the things we think we ought to be looking at in more detail. The president then has to take that set of framing questions and directions and get many, many more stakeholders with a lot of different types of expertise engaged in thinking through them, keeping the board informed about the progress and going back to the board periodically for updates and eventually for approval. So it's a wonderful dance. It's a wonderful back and forth process where each party understands its role and knows that really the entire thing, whatever it is, whatever strategic opportunity it is, cannot be accomplished unless they work in tandem, that the roles are complementary, and that together they can create results that are better for the institution than either could do alone.
There are clearly risks to shared governance in our institutions. First and foremost is perhaps a board that doesn't recognize the critical nature of including the various stakeholders in addressing the kinds of challenges institutions face. Several things happen. One, I think you lose quality of input to some big issues that only professionals in a specific field can add value on. Secondly, you begin to fragment the sense of engagement from stakeholders whose input you really want to value or want to benefit from. If boards send a signal that they both have all of the authority and they won't delegate any of it in an accountable way to those who could add value on critical issues, you weaken the entire institution. And when you add that to the array of challenges, from funding challenges to the pressures of addressing questions like how our students learn and how we're going to teach them going forward, the whole question of online education, we weaken the academy if we don't implement shared governance effectively with the faculty. With the administration, there's even a potential for higher risk. If boards are not acting in a way that is truly supportive of strong and effective leadership and allowing their presidents to lead them through these far more turbulent times in which higher education is coping with change, then what we run the risk of having are boards that are heading off in one direction, not fully not in full sync with the expectations that they have of their presidents, and a lack of clarity of what the presidents might think they should expect from their board. Presidents and boards, in the context of shared governance, need to be certain that what they have at the end of the day is trust and a commitment to mutual expectations. And those need to be addressed, framed, thought through, and committed to. And once those are in shape and agreed upon, that's when a board can hold the president truly accountable for moving the institution forward. When there's a breakdown in establishing those expectations both ways, between a president, a chief executive officer or system, and the CEO's governing board, that's when we run a higher degree of risk of shared governance at that level failing to do what it needs to do. Unfortunately, there are many examples of failed governance and failed strategic governance. Some demonstrated by boards that are overly engaged and make decisions based upon information that only they believe they've acquired through reading of newspapers or watching TV or whatever their source may be, but they have forgotten the fact that they operate in a sandbox, if you will, that appropriately includes other stakeholders to help affect the kind of decisions that need to be made. So when a board of trustees claims a decision based on information that only they have acquired, and they indicate that they have the ultimate authority to make any decision they choose to make, and clearly demonstrate the lack of respect that's so essential in moving these institutions forward, especially in difficult times, to or for any of the other stakeholders, that is a risk that we've not only seen examples of, but may increasingly be at risk of occurring going forward, because the stakes, because the pressures are so profound in both public and private higher education. Increasingly, we run the risk of boards just saying, we know what's best, we have experience from our own corporate roles or other external positions that they hold, and we're going to move forward because we have to move quickly. On the other hand, we've seen institutions where boards have actually fallen asleep at the switch, and the part of shared governance that has failed for them is their own engagement. There are other examples where boards have, and I think part of it has to do with the fact that so many of them are not appropriately informed or oriented to an understanding of what shared governance is, where the model has fallen apart. The last example is one that I think we're hearing too often, and that is the fact that an increasing number of college and university presidents, a position that is the true definition of a 24/7 responsibility, are not getting the kind of support and trusted support from their boards. And that creates a kind of ripple effect that's felt throughout a campus. Increasingly, we've seen presidents receive votes of no confidence from faculty. Even boards of trustees are receiving votes of no confidence. And a lot of that has to do with the level of engagement that is perceived, starting with the Board of Trustees. And we're seeing that at an increasing number of places.
I would tell new board members to read as much as they can. I would encourage new board members to talk with members of the board who've been on the board for a while to get a sense of institutional history. I would encourage new board members to take advantage of any opportunities for their own professional development, AGB meetings, other forms of retreat that would enable them to expand their knowledge, and to talk very openly and candidly with their presidents about areas of concern. I think working together, governance is a wonderful opportunity to shape the future in many ways, and we need our board members to be as focused and at the same time patient as we work through a very interesting time in higher education.
As we come to the last part of this online board education program, there are certain key factors I think that might be helpful to summarize. It is clear that boards have specific sets of responsibilities, and those of you serving on boards have specific expectations for your service and your contribution to the work of your board as well. And before digging into what we like to think of as kind of the standards of the most effective governing boards out there, let me just point to three areas that encompass the overall set of responsibilities and expectations that those of us at AGB and those of us who work with many boards over many years often think about. First is about the ultimate accountability of any governing board of a system or a campus. It is essential for boards and therefore members of the board to have a clear sense of to whom and for what their service and responsibility extends, starting with a level of accountability for students and the institution and its reputation and mission and the quality of its education. Bearing that in mind helps a board steer its work and shape its agenda in a most effective way. So that's first. Second, we would advocate that boards and board members not only protect the independence of the institution or the system that they serve, but also work diligently to ensure that as an individual member of your board, you are not only following the specific fiduciary standards that have already been shared with you in this program, but that you recognize that your independence, both in listening and processing and adding value to the conversations taking place within your board and committee meetings, is essential for the transparency and quality of the conversation and the respect that colleagues both internally and externally will have for your individual service and the overall quality of the service of your board and its colleagues. And thirdly, before we get to some specific, what we call habits of effective boards, thirdly, I think, is something that boards and board members often overlook, and I'd like to encourage you to think about. Board members should bring their own expertise. You were recruited and invited to serve for a number of reasons, not the least of which is the fact that each of you bring a specific set of interests, expertise, capacities, and commitment to the table along with your colleagues. How you apply these specifics really has a lot to do with the nature of your institution's mission and the culture and engagement and level of participation across your board. But let me start, and you see it on the screen. The first item is creating a culture of inclusion. We think that everybody on the board has both a need, a right, but also an expectation of adding value to conversations and strategic challenges and areas of oversight that are coming before the board. What that does not mean is that every single board member needs to expect that they need to be heard on every issue coming before the board. But what it does encourage is the opportunity for people to feel that they are adding value to the issues that are being addressed. Much of that creation of a sense of inclusion impacts board culture. For us, board culture means the dynamic of individuals working together for a common good and the process by which members around the table who should be sharing that commitment, there may be differences of opinion, but a sense that all views are welcomed and conversation should be as broadly inclusive among board members as possible. Board leadership, board chairs, institutional leaders, presidents, chancellors, should be making sure that all board members feel the opportunity and are encouraged to participate regularly. You've already had on the second item a review earlier in this set of modules about fiduciary principles. Those of us at AGB feel strongly that boards and board members need to have a clear understanding of what those fiduciary principles are. There's clear law within the state of Texas, and there are other clarifying principles around the responsibility of fiduciaries, but the duties of loyalty, the duty of unity, as it's referred to in Texas standards, are crucial to protect individual and institutional as well as board independence, but it also clarifies the scope as well as the limits of the responsibilities and the authority of individual board members, and how the board as an entity, as a fiduciary body, which it is, needs to carry out its responsibilities and protect against such things as conflicts of interest and confusing personal goals and interests with the best interests and the mission of the institution that you serve. Keeping an eye on fiduciary principles is both important, it respects state law, and it creates an effective roadmap for board members to think about when thinking about their service. Cultivating a healthy relationship with institutional senior administrators is fundamental. We have witnessed over too many years and too many institutions beyond Texas where boards confuse their responsibility in the area of policy and strategy and looking forward, if you will, with at times an overabundance of enthusiasm to weigh in on areas or in areas that really are both the prerogative but also the essential responsibility of management. First, that's inappropriate. And second, it absorbs time better spent by boards in the area of responsibility that they are in fact charged with pursuing, and that is the long-term goals, interests, policies of the institution or system that they serve to ensure that the mission is being met, that students are being served and provided the highest quality academic programs that can be established and delivered within your system or institution, and that they are successfully graduating with a degree or a certificate that enables them to take their place in society or to be competitive in the 21st century workforce. So we counsel boards and board members not to confuse management with their policy responsibilities. It's not always easy, but it is something that you should hold up as the priority for the board's role and responsibility. Board chairs and the selection of board chairs are different in just about every institution. We urge that board chairs are selected with an eye on people who can lead effective groups, who have a respect for the work of the board and everyone who serves on that board, and who can collaborate well with senior administration and provide that bridge between your board and the administration to be representative of your institution's governing body with other stakeholders, including faculty in the area of shared governance. Just as a sidebar, and I know shared governance was addressed earlier in the program, but demonstrating to stakeholders in a time of accelerated change throughout society and in higher education, demonstrating to stakeholders like faculty and policy leaders and the corporate sector should be inclusive of the board's voice in front of these stakeholders when the opportunities are presented, and the selection, therefore, of board leadership is a very important choice that the board needs to make. Governance committees are at times overlooked in public institutions and public system boards. I would only advocate that it not be overlooked within the boards in Texas. While there may be minimal influence in the selection of future board members, an effective governance committee can play a very appropriate and effective role in ensuring that members of the board and the board as a whole understand their specific responsibilities and help hold those board members and the board to account for making sure that they are effective stewards as governing bodies of their institution or system. A strong and effective governance committee chaired by among the most respected members of your board is crucial for a board that wants to achieve and maintain a level of effectiveness that all of us who serve on boards strive for every day. Moving on to board committees, and we realize that overall the numbers of board members on many of your boards is effectively small, much smaller than private colleges and universities. Having said that, structuring the work, the important strategic work of a board, or delegating much of that work to standing committees is an effective way to really process important issues. It helps with issues related to openness of meetings, allowing boards to really get to the core of some issues that might not attract external audiences and participants. But perhaps most importantly, it enables board members who may be more reluctant to engage at a plenary session of the board to really bring to bear their thoughts their questions and concerns, and that expertise I referred to earlier to bear on some of the key issues facing the institution. Moving on the list in front of you, strategic risk factors. This is an area, quite candidly, that we within this association would like to see more governing boards pursue. That is the traditional model of enterprise risk assessment or risk management as a means by which board members who might in their daily professional careers factor risk assessment into that work, or on the boards they may serve on in the corporate sector, that same approach to some of the strategic challenges facing your institution and your system. There's a lot of good work that's been done on risk assessment in higher education, and we call your attention to that. I already alluded to academic quality and areas of student completion as something that we think that highly effective boards need and are increasingly spending their time looking at. It is something that for many board members might or might not be an area that they expected to be called upon to consider in carrying out their oversight and strategic responsibilities. But at the end of the day, your institutions are about education. They are about providing opportunities for your students to fill their role either in Texas or elsewhere as effective citizens, and to provide them opportunities to enter the 21st century workforce. Part of your job as a fiduciary body is to ensure that the academic programs you are delivering meet the standards of the highest quality that you and your faculty and administrators can ensure, and that you oversee the success of your students. There is no bigger waste in higher education than students you admit who do not complete their education successfully. And ultimately, as the fiduciary body of your system, of your institution, it befalls to you as part of your accountability to make sure that your students are being successful in their educational pursuits. We referred to shared governance. Boards historically have had challenging relationships and uneven relationships with faculty who are so obviously essential to the quality and the delivery and the brand, therefore, of the institution that you oversee as fiduciaries. Many places, maybe your own, maybe not, have seen relationships with faculty be strained. Some of those issues are appropriate, some of them less so. But what we do sense is, in many places, a lack of real understanding between boards and faculty and other stakeholders about the commitment and the responsibilities that each of them have for the success of your institution and your students. Boards that really do look for a successful institution and a successful educational opportunity would be wise and would demonstrate a level of consequential governance and a higher degree of effectiveness by reaching out to faculty governing bodies, and if your places have unionized faculty, even in that structure, to indicate that there may be challenges, there may be issues, but we need to work together, including faculty, in the strategic challenges, and conversation about those facing your enterprise is smart governance and sends a signal that you care about those individuals who at the end of the day deliver the product that you are overseeing. Finally, I finish where we started. At the end of the day, you as board members, you as boards, have both a moral and a legal responsibility for being accountable to your students, to the state, and to the broader society, to be sure that the work you do is focused on facilitating the future interests of the state through the collective education of your students. Getting governance right, in summary, is an exciting opportunity for those of you who now have the honor of serving your state through your service on your board. It takes time, it takes study, it takes engagement, it takes commitment, it takes some curiosity. But at the end of the day, it takes the collective input and leadership of the board on which you serve in collaboration with the leadership of your institution. We wish you well on your journey of leading your institutions and your system. You are about some important work.